All right. Good morning, everyone. I always say good afternoon. No, it is good afternoon. I do this every time. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Crazy Talk. If this is your first time tuning into Crazy Talk, I am your host, Lee Thomas. And so if this is your first time tuning into Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV talk show where we talk about all sorts of things related to mental health and mental illness and everything in between. Again, I'm your host, Lee Thomas. If this is not your first time tuning into Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. I am so glad to see you here again. So I'm really, really lucky in this episode 12 of Crazy Talk, to be joined by Isa Urrutia. Isa is a PhD student at the University of Toronto who is using their PhD to investigate and understand their own experience, including how we think about eating disorders in kind of a westernized context. So Isa, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So PhD, first of all, I'm just wildly impressed because I'm like, oh, I finished my undergrad and then I was like, oh, too much school. So good on you for that. But that's a really interesting thing to be kind of pursuing and spending so much of your time pursuing. So how did you get into kind of that line of academic interest, I guess?
Okay. Well, I guess the story of the PhD and the story of the subject matter of the PhD are really intertwined because they're both they're just who I am and about my story. So I have to say I didn't start out anywhere near this area of research at all. I started out I studied pure mathematics as my undergraduate degree. I did that in Mexico, where I'm from and where my family is and where I did most of my school. And then I came to Canada for grad school, and maybe you can tell from my accent, I don't have an accent that marks me as visibly foreign, which helps me navigate with ease through Canadian contexts. But I came to Canada for grad school the first time around, and I went to Waterloo to do mathematics. And I did a master's degree in that. But throughout that, I was struggling with some relapses in my own eating disorder. And so moving to Canada, being away from my family for the first time, being back to Canada for the first time as an adult, even though that's where my mom grew up, I struggled a lot in school. And I had always wanted to do a PhD because I was very ambitious. I wanted to be a mathematician and a researcher and discover math, new types of math. But then I had the eating disorder relapse, and my mental health just went into the ditches, and I wasn't taking care of myself. So I took some time off. I did some data analysis, and then I went back to grad school. And then I did another master's degree, but without the pressure of feeling like I had to be the best and, prove that I was worthy of being in this Canadian university and doing very well. And I studied in that degree, that master's degree, I studied food waste. Mm-hmm. So I went and think about this through the lens of somebody who's had issues with food and trying to figure out if they're normal or not, or if they're normal, if they're eating like other people or not. I was interviewing people about so how did you decide what to eat that day? And what were you eating? Okay. And how did you decide that was enough and that should be thrown out, right? And I'm taking notes. And then I thought, well, then I got into the PhD, and that was very lucky. But I kind of thought at this point, well, you're kidding yourself, Isa, in pretending that what you're interested in here is food waste. Sure, I'm interested in food waste, but you're interested in seeing how other people eat because you don't know what you're doing right. And if you're doing it right, and you want to know how other people feel about food. And so I started being more interested in issues of eating and identity and how do we deal with these things. And I was starting to read eating disorder articles, and I thought, well, just do it, right? Why am I pretending that this is not what it's about? So now I'm studying eating disorders finally. And since I jumped ship into trying to understand my own experience, I decided to try to shape a project around how people understand eating disorders in folks who have these experiences of migration and growing up in more than one world and more than one language. And of course, I'm a very I had a lot of ease of navigating like the Canadian Mexican border, which, you know, is not a geographic, there's no border, but like the experience of crossing the border in that direction. I have both a Canadian and a Mexican passport, so I don't struggle with issues of immigration. But I've started hearing about stories of other folks who inhabit not the same space as me, but spaces that are also kind of intersecting Latin America, or the land we call Latin America, and Canada, and how these interact. And so I'm trying to really delve into understanding eating disorders for folks who've migrated and have all these extra complications to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah, and that sounds super interesting. And I'm always really like interested in kind of the intersections of eating disorders with other identities. Mm-hmm. But I think for some people, they have a hard time understanding that things like mental health issues do have other intersections, if that makes sense. People are like, oh, you know, if you experience an eating disorder, it doesn't matter. You know, you hear often that mental health issues don't discriminate, right? Which I always think in a sense is true, but, you know, we live in a society that does, and we can't forget that. So is that a stumbling block that you see a lot of people kind of hitting in their understanding of things like eating disorders?
Yeah, I say like there are two ways that I take that and frame it. Like, one issue is, how does who you are and you are read as, and the way your body is read, affect your experience with eating disorders? We can think about it as it intersects your access to healthcare, like just navigating systems of healthcare, and how you are understood within these systems. And then the second, I think it affects the way that you interact with the concept or the theoretical idea of what an eating disorder is and who it's supposed to affect, right? So healthcare navigation, and then just like the PhD, right? So the theoretical part. So access, like, I mean, I'm sure you I haven't watched all your episodes, but I'm sure you've talked before about like all the stuff. Like, I think there's some great work with folks in like the fat activist community who are talking about like just how hard it is to get proper healthcare for anything, let alone an eating disorder, which is already so stigmatized and misunderstood. Walking into the doctor because you have something wrong with your nerves, and I'm thinking about a particular friend, and being told, oh, you need to lose weight. And she's like, has nothing to do. And if this person looked different, they'd get a completely different and perhaps more thorough treatment from their healthcare provider. So there's these types of things. But then also issues with literacy around eating disorders, right? Because if I feel like everybody is saying this, if eating disorders are conceived as something that is present in people who are white and slim and Western, then if somebody walks in who doesn't fit that image, let alone other intersections, they might not get diagnosed. So there's some good work going on in that arena, but there's clearly still a lot to do. I wonder about people's experiences in healthcare, if it is getting better or not, but I don't have any data other than anecdotes of really bad experiences people have had in that arena, so I can't say anything towards the general state of whether that's improving or not.
Yeah, I also only have anecdotes when it comes to kind of particularly eating disorder treatment, but also like kind of general mental health treatment. Yeah, and so I'm not like necessarily a researcher, although, you know, we're all researchers in our own experience, but I'm not trying to like diminish what you're doing. But you know what I mean? Like that whole idea that like I'm also trying to understand my own experience just in a very different way. But that whole idea of like not fitting an image, I think is so prevalent in people. And it's prevalent in people even who like I would say someone like myself who, you know, was read as a woman for a very long time and who is white and who is, you know, kind of straight sized but not particularly slim, but I still didn't fit that image of who I thought had an eating disorder, which is someone who is like, you know, pretty and skinny and quiet and straight. And because I wasn't all of those things, that meant I didn't have an eating disorder. So to have then all of those additional kind of obstacles to overcome, those additional kind of intersections that are telling you don't fit this model and you don't fit this story, I think it goes back to that idea of kind of stigma agreement, and that idea of, you know, those stories that we're told that we internalize without, because they've never been challenged in our world, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I think a lot of the work that kind of eating disorder activists have to do is, like, you know, we can't necessarily change whether or not someone has an eating disorder, or we can't change whether or not, you know, ideally we can change whether the health care system treats them well, but we can start to expand people's ideas of like what someone who has an eating disorder and therefore deserves help looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, like the stigma, the being read as woman thing, like the stigma too is because there's that stigma that it's about wanting to look like a model in a fashion magazine, right? And if that's not really part of you, then admitting to an eating disorder is like kind of admitting to this, but maybe it doesn't fit with how you see yourself and your body, and so that makes it tough.
Yeah, and when I was getting my eating disorder treatment, it was very much like the narrative was women get eating disorders because they want to be thin and womanly, and men get eating disorders because they want to be super muscly and manly. And I was like, that really doesn't, neither of those really fit with me, right?
The two boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so I guess speaking a little bit more towards the project, then there's also this thing of, if you're somebody who has an eating disorder, and it's just like when you're somebody who is doing a lot of work towards issues with feminism and gender and these types of things, and you get an eating disorder, then there's lots of there could be an issue of feeling like you're betraying this super body positivity, my body is fine, because you're struggling with eating and bodies, and your brain's doing things when you eat and getting stressed out. But if you're also doing stuff with related to race, there's this issue too. Like, I've seen, who is this author? Maybe I shouldn't name names. No, it's okay.
Yeah,
there's an author called Hesse. I don't know how to pronounce it. But there's some people who theorize why people get eating disorders in like immigrant populations, saying, on the same note, right? You want to look like the white, pretty magazine model. If eating disorders are caused by culture that tells us that this is what beauty is, then it follows, these theories say, that people who are immigrating and who are maybe dark-skinned Latinas, which I'm not, right, or who are like racialized because they're coming into this context where they're racialized, then they get an eating disorder because they want to look like this, right? Because they want to look like a white slim woman, and that is so insulting. Because, and then they say, well, obviously, what we need is just for people to accept their natural beauty or something like that. And I'm like, well, that's just like taking on this very simplified understanding of eating disorders as a pursuit of beauty through slimness, and then superimposing this idea onto people who come from a completely different context. Like, that's a way to completely erase other people's experiences. I don't know. I'm trying to say something complicated, but I don't know if it's coming out straight.
No, that totally makes sense. And it's an issue that I struggle with kind of conceptually, because on the one hand, I know that eating disorders are not all about wanting to be slim and attractive and all of these things. But I know that, like, and it kind of felt like, for part of my own experience, that was a little bit what it was about. Even if it wasn't about pursuing womanhood necessarily, like there was definitely this whole, I want my body to look a certain way. It was just for me that was a thin androgynous shape that my body was never going to be. And so I always have these kind of two conflicting things in my mind, where on the one hand, I know that it's not solely about, you know, those kind of cultural standards of beauty, but also that maybe they do play a role, and I don't know how to reconcile those two, because I feel like they've become divided into like they've become quite divided in their camps, I feel like, in kind of the eating disorder community.
Well, we moralize bodies so much, and then the way that you're read affects your job, and whether you're considered to be intelligent or whether you're considered to be hardworking, and all these things that have so little to do with bodies. We just project all this meaning onto bodies. Like, I I think that all the fat activist stuff is so important because it's about contesting these messages, right? Like this I think can lead to, like, of course we've internalized it, right? We're not living separate from culture where we're like, I said the word culture. Oops. We're completely inscribed in these social contexts. Of course we can't separate ourselves from them, and we can't pretend that we don't see that certain bodies are treated better in terms of labor and human rights and access to healthcare. Like,
yeah. And it's one of those things where that was something that I hadn't necessarily thought about until kind of, and like obviously I thought about kind of like intersections of stories and various intersections around eating disorders, but the idea that sometimes, and I would be the last person to be like, eating disorders are a choice. Like, I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but sometimes, you know, because nothing happens kind of outside of the vacuum of society, people engage in disordered eating behaviors a lot of the time because we do recognize that there's a social capital there, right? Like, and so the work that fat activists are doing, I think, is in questioning and just bringing that to light, like bringing to light that certain bodies are treated more poorly, I think is so important, because then we can problematize it. But for so long, like, I grew up in small town Northern Alberta, right? We did not problematize that at all. Like, the whole idea that thin was something everyone wanted to be, that was just like rubber stamped. That was just facts, right?
I like that you said engaging in behaviors that could be related to eating disorders, because I think it's important to make that distinction, right? Like the practices in and of themselves. Some people can engage in the practices and be in and out of it in a week, right? Other people engage in the practices and then suddenly you're on that long continuum train between, okay, I'm recovered-ish, recovering, or never identify as recovered. Because there are a lot of, like, I don't feel like I can truly, honestly say that I identify it as recovered, because it's like a day-by-day thing.
Yeah.
A lot of better days. Today is a good day.
Yeah, no, I totally know what you mean. It's and it reminds me, like, and I didn't know about this again until the NEDIC conference where I met you, which was fabulous. But I went to a session about eating disorders and substance use, and how much overlap there is with eating disorders and substance related disorders, which brought back I was on a panel at Dalhousie University like many years ago, and I was on a panel with someone who had an alcohol related substance disorder. He identified as being an alcoholic, and the phrase that he used was, you know, there were 100 students like me who were drinking just like I was, and I became an alcoholic and they did not. And to me, that, like, because there were, you know, when I went to fitness classes and when I did this and that, there were 100 other people who were engaging in the same behavior as I was. And, you know, granted, statistically, some of them probably did have eating disorders, but some of them could do it and not have eating disorders. And so that just really resonated with me, being like, oh, it's like that, where some people can engage in the behaviors and not develop eating disorders, and some people do develop eating disorders, and where that line is.
So I'll say something towards this. This is personal experience. I feel like I need to, I'm taking a methods course, and I'm like trying to do a better job separating researcher from person strategically at some points, not pretending you can never be two people. But like, my spouse is a slender person, right? And has been trying to eat healthier for many reasons related to chronic health and degenerative health conditions, and has generally had a positive experience trying to eat healthier. And I say healthier because it's super complicated, right? Trying to actually eat vegetables and things like that, right? And this has been like a years and years process. But never had any pressure or never had any linking to practices of restriction or to practices of that being tied up or assumed to be in the pursuit of slimness, and was fine about it and had a generally positive experience. If you're doing that if you're engaging in these same practices, like, oh, you know, my gut doesn't really work well when I eat these foods, and I think maybe I'm needing more fiber, so I'm gonna I'm going to try to change around the way I'm eating, and I'm going to try to see if I can do something so that my digestion is going better. And you're read as someone who's fat, or you're somebody who has this pressure to look more of a certain way, then what you're eating and you're trying to be healthier is necessarily going to be read through the lens of that you're trying to lose weight, and maybe it's going to it's going to be more susceptible to restriction, right?
Yeah.
It's like we can problematize health, but these, I don't know, it's again separating from academic experience, right? Like, you can engage in these behaviors without these social pressures. So then maybe the social pressures are also a bit of an issue. Of course, also the stuff I don't want to not acknowledge the role of trauma and the role of stress and like difficult life experiences, but there's that, right?
Yeah. And we do like, and it's so, I always hate like pointing the finger at society, because it's like, I want to point the finger at something that can like, that there's someone who can make changes, you know what I mean? It's hard to be like, society is a problem, because then it's like, what do you do about that?
Yeah.
But we do, live in a society, that has a very, and again, that idea of health is a really kind of nebulous concept in itself, but I think that overall has quite an unhealthy relationship with things like food and exercise. And so, like I recently got to a place where I thought that exercise was something that I could pursue again. And I was like looking up, like, I haven't been to a gym in years. Like, how do I lift weights again? And so I was looking that up, and everything I got was like, here's how to lift weights to lose weight. And I was like, that's not what I'm looking for though. Right. But it's so hard to find things that are separating those two things, because it's just almost like a taken for granted that if you are exercising, you want to lose weight. You know what I mean? And it's so hard to like extract those two things for people who haven't done that work, right?
Yeah. Oh, I have to figure out how I feel about exercise. This is the thing I'm dealing with right now.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where like I also I just did a post about this on Facebook, kind of about self-care, and it really made me think particularly around things of food and exercise, where I think a lot of the times it's not what you're doing, it's why you're doing it, right? Like, so that whole like, if I am trying to eat a certain way to maintain a certain body shape versus if I'm trying to eat a certain way to maintain blood pressure or the sensations that I feel or whatever it is. But I think a lot of the times with eating disorders, your brain can kind of trick you, you know what I mean? Into being like, you are trying to be healthy. And then like, there's that little eating disorder part of your brain that's like, and if you are healthy, you will look this certain way. And like, again, trying to extract those two kind of voices, I guess.
I think for me, it's like, there was Andrea Lamar, who was also, I met you, and I met Andrea at the, I say Andrea because that's how I say my, I don't know, posted something about exercise on Instagram, and I thought, what was it? Oh shoot! I just remember what I'll just say what I said, because I don't want to misremember what the Instagram said. But the gist of it is that since these are practices, like exercise is a practice, it just gets mediated through whatever your brain decides to process it through. Like, there's a lens, and I'll speak for myself, right? If I'm in a good place and I'm engaging in these eating practices or maybe exercise practices, then I can engage in them through a healthy place. But it is true that these are practices that if there's a bit of stress or there's something that's going on, it is so easy to switch into, oh, you're worried about this stuff, let's just focus it all on food. You don't have to worry about all these really big things. Just worry about what you're eating and how much you're moving your body. So it's really a day by day thing.
Yeah.
And then of course that's why we say the issue with eating disorders is you have to eat.
Yeah.
and then it's stressful, and then it's difficult, and you get through it. And exercise, though, that's one that you can kind of put on a shelf until you're ready to deal with it, but not eating.
Yeah, eating is something, there aren't a lot of things that you need to recover from that you need to engage in every single day.
And more than once a day.
And more than once a day. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's a wild ride. Like, I don't really have anything to say other than that, which is, I guess I'm at a bit of a loss for words, because it is one of those things where, like, sometimes, I guess, as someone who is working in this field and who, you know, like has projects on the go and that sort of thing, do you ever feel that you need to manage frustration? Because I find that that's a big thing for me, is like, I get frustrated with the state of the world, where I'm like, it just shouldn't be this way. And then a lot of what I have had to do as a mental health advocate is manage my own frustration, right? And so I don't get burned out. Do you ever find that?
Yeah. I don't know. I get frustrated at myself a lot. Yeah. I think it's just that I've been supported by such wonderful people in the projects I'm doing that my perspective has shifted a little bit on that. Like, I'll say that what the doing of my PhD project, so like there's a theoretical piece, and I'm trying to think about how we think about culture and eating disorders together. Specifically for immigrant folks, right? But there's an action part to my research. It's a thing called action research, which is you don't just collect data and think about it, but you do something, right? Action, do. Yeah. And so what we're trying to do with this project is we're trying to create support spaces. And so I feel like having the opportunity to work with people who are really engaged in this topic from the same perspective that I am, or from similar perspectives than what I bring to the table, and this opportunity to create community and relationships has been really helpful for trying to see a way forward. Mm-hmm. So like there wasn't a space for us to kind of talk about how we want to be supported, so we created that space. And that was inspired by work by like Gloria Lucas from Nalgona Positivity Pride, the Chicanx eating disorder group in LA, and all these things. And so I feel like there are pockets of change. And going back to the other point, society doesn't change. No, I think like there's these pockets of creating different spaces. Mm-hmm. Like those are really important to recognize. And then what I did, I just like created one of these pockets of space around myself to help myself support myself through these moments of just being frustrated. And then, and I think that's been really helpful. Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. And I love that. Like that whole, you know, society can change, absolutely, and so I'm glad you pointed that out.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to invalidate that, because like the frustration is real, right? Like these things are coming up in reaction to something. They're not just popping out of the blue and let's kind of like, you know, be friends and make a new club. These are reactionary spaces, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're reacting to all these things that we're seeing that don't seem to be changing. There is this quote I love by, this is a scholar. He's a historian who studies civil rights in the States. I think he's at UCLA. I don't remember. His name is Robin Kelly, and he talks. He's a historian of civil rights movement. So he talks about. Just looking it up. Movements of resistance and Black radical thought in the States. And so he wrote this book called Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination. And this is a book that, like, I don't want to erase the context of this, because it's historically grounded. It's grounded in certain social movements. But what he was saying was that if we just measure the success of social movements by like the material outputs and by what we're trying to change, then of course we're always going to feel like we're losing, right? Because there's always you look at all these movements, look at all the stuff that's happening right now with Black Lives Matter and all that. Like, it's frustrating. Of course, it's frustrating. What can we learn from this? Other than like what can other social movements learn from these spaces? I think he says, well, don't just think about the material outputs of the social movement as a way to evaluate its success. He says instead, think about the visions that are created in these social spaces, right? That's why it's called Freedom Dreams, his book, because it's about these dreams. And I think I don't want to appropriate this to a different context, but don't want to appropriate, but that's a terrible sentence structure. Like I think what Robin Kelly is saying is the dreams and the visions that are created out of these social movements are also important and are also valuable. And this helps us not imagine ourselves as just like working in our own, being this subject in a university. In my case, right? That's where you can see the histories of these colonial structures in the context of the university, or in other contexts where you can see the ways that these discourses about bodies are oppressive. Instead, you can imagine, just as these histories and these discourses are like grounded in long histories, so are the movements of resistance towards these long histories. And so whenever there's been a fight back, and we're not alone because we're standing on the shoulders of all these other movements that have come before that have been pushing stuff back to a point where it is now. And it's a long view, but I think it's a way to take comfort and also to not lose momentum and lose perspective of where we are in these fights, if that makes sense.
That absolutely makes sense. And I love it. And I'm going to be turning that over in my head for a while, and I can't believe it, but we are actually a little bit over time, which I'm I'm so glad about, because this has been such an incredible conversation. We are absolutely going to have you back on the show. But if someone is watching this and they're like, this was an incredible episode of Crazy Talk, which they would be correct, and they want to kind of do something, if they're feeling inspired to act in some way, what would you like someone watching this show to do next?
I forgot to talk about our projects and all the wonderful people that are supporting us. So I'll send a long list of links, and please go check out all these organizations that are non-for-profit and of course don't have a lot of money. Go support us and follow us on Instagram and all that. The links, I will send you all the links.
We will put all of the links down in the comments. Thank you so much for joining us, Isa. This has been an incredible episode. I really appreciate you being on here. If you are watching this show and you're thinking, wow, Crazy Talk is fabulous, you are also correct. And you can get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to your inbox by signing up for my mailing list. And I will put a link to my mailing list in the comments as well. Thank you all so much, and have a great afternoon.